kind of without pause are the human rights groups as well as environmental groups. And the IMF and the World Bank and other bilateral donors constantly complain that China, because of their policy of non-interference, allows rogue African nations an out for these important conditionalities that they think are critical in order to build good governance, to build and strengthen democracy. And then, of course, there are complaints about the cheap and copy Chinese goods and the poor quality of the construction projects and these kinds of Africa becoming a kind of dumping ground for cheap Chinese goods. So that's kind of the kind of broader context within which we can try to place these African perceptions that we were finding. Okay. I think it's always important when you talk about kind of migration and the numbers, even though it's hard to distinguish exactly how many there are, to put all of that in context. So in Lesotho, there are probably at least 5,000, but possibly as many as 10,000 Chinese. But this is in a country that is tiny. It's one of the smallest countries in Africa, but it's also small in terms of population. And the population is actually shrinking due to the horrifying impact of HIV/AIDS in that country, but also because of constant regular outmigration. There are probably more Basotho who were born in Lesotho who are living in South Africa than remain in Lesotho. You know, in this context, you know, you have suddenly the presence of 5,000, maybe even 10,000 Chinese. It has a huge impact. And the Chinese have been engaged historically, the Taiwanese in the garment and textile industry, and then the newer Chinese migrants are coming into the retail sector, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. In Zimbabwe, the numbers of Chinese estimates are about the same, between 5 and 10,000, but this is in a country of just over 12 million. And there's some small-scale investment, lots of government-to-government kind of linkages there. And there are, when I was there was definitely evidence of Chinese military kind of engagement with ZANU-PF government kind of folks. And then handful of small retailers that you can find evidence of in and around the streets of Harare. And even in the last few years, growth in the number of Chinese restaurants around town. Okay, and in South Africa, you have at least 350,000, perhaps as many as 500,000 ethnic Chinese. Okay, and I write ethnic Chinese here because in South Africa we have about 10 to 12,000 Chinese South Africans that I mentioned earlier, who are South African-born, South African citizens, born of South African citizens. So we're talking at least second, third, even fourth generation South Africans who are ethnically Chinese. You also have a small community of Taiwanese who've been in the country since the 1970s and 1980s, and there are about 6,000 Taiwanese, and of those, almost all have also become naturalized citizens, and so they're also South Africans now. And then you have on top of that this huge number of new Chinese migrants. A small percentage of the new Chinese migrants have also become either permanent residents or citizens, but the vast majority of these new Chinese migrants have only been in the country a very short time. Most of the people that we interviewed over the last 5 years had only been in the country for 2, 3, 4, 5 years at most. Most of them didn't speak much English. Most of them thought they would eventually go back to China. And so for them, it was very much a sojourn, a temporary migration in order to try to make some money. But the other important thing to recall about South Africa is the Chinese, it's the largest number overall, but South Africa also has the largest population of the 3 countries. And the Chinese are scattered throughout the country, and they're engaged in the widest range of economic activities. So the impact's not just in one sector, in one town. Okay. And I'm gonna, so the rest of this is a lot of photos that I've taken through the course of my field research. Hopefully kind of keep you guys awake through this afternoon. So in in Lesotho, there are two key sites of tension around the Chinese. And the first, which is not so much a huge problem anymore, but was a big problem earlier, is around the textile and clothing manufacturing sector. There are probably a couple dozen Taiwanese-owned textile factories like this one, most of them in and around Maseru. Okay. The Taiwanese in Lesotho arrived in significant numbers in the 1970s. There are probably about 400 or 500 Taiwanese members of the Taiwanese Lesotho Chamber of Commerce. But interestingly, all of those people don't actually live in Lesotho. The Taiwanese Lesotho Chamber of Commerce actually also includes Taiwanese who are living in South Africa, but in cities that border Lesotho. And so socially, they're much more engaged with Lesotho Taiwanese than with South African Taiwanese. So there are a number of people in Vicksburg, Lady Brand, and Wepner on the South African side of the border, but they all consider themselves one community. Okay, and the textile and clothing manufacturing sector is, and this is one of the scary things about Lesotho, this currently employs about 35,000 people, mostly women. It's the second largest employer in the country after the government. Okay, so that gives you some sense of the state of the economy and development in that country, that a dozen, 2 dozen companies can come in and have this impact. And there have been lots and lots of complaints, mostly through the early 2000s, about the labor conditions. But since about 2005, they actually implemented a special interministerial task team, which includes representation from various labor unions, as well as the textile industry and government. They've actually been working together really closely to kind of sort out any serious problems in the industry. And so a lot of the kind of horrific labor abuses that you had in the early 2000s seem to have been addressed. And in fact, because of a lot of pressure that the labor unions were able to put on these textile unions through their buyers. So it was through campaigns like the Gap Red campaign that, I don't know if you guys recall, several years ago was kind of big, that kind of required companies to have fair labor policies, and it was kind of like the whole fair trade deal, and it required these companies to have HIV/AIDS education and all kinds of services for their workers, that they were able to, it was kind of from the buyers through to the factories that they were able to put some pressure on and actually improve conditions for the workers in those places. So a lot of the industry-specific problems have been addressed, but whereas these factories used to produce a lot for the South African market, they now produce under AGOA and other international agreements for the US and other smaller Western markets. And so when the US is suffering from economic downturn and you don't go and buy as much from the Gap as you used to, ladies in Lesotho actually lose their jobs. And so there's been a huge shrinkage. Almost half of the women who used to work in the textile industry no longer have jobs. And even this gets spun in a way that the Chinese are blamed. So there were articles at one stage in the local Lesotho, one of the local Lesotho papers, saying that HIV/AIDS is on the rise because of the Chinese. And they were basically arguing that because the textile factories weren't able to get enough orders to maintain the workers that they had, they were laying people off, and the women who were no longer able to work in the textile factories were resorting to prostitution to put bread on the table. And therefore there was a rise in HIV/AIDS, and the way it was spun was this was all the fault of those Chinese. So you can see how these dynamics kind of have this kind of impact locally. So it's still under pressure, and Lesotho is, still struggling. So the second major site of tension in Lesotho are around Chinese in retail, and throughout Maseru you'll see shops. Actually, not even throughout Maseru, throughout Lesotho, in even the remotest mountain village, you will see Chinese shops and Chinese grocery stores, and the Chinese are now dominating retail, and they are probably most significantly displacing locals. Okay, can flip to the next slide. So, this is the typical kind of Basotho blankets that women wear around their bodies. Lesotho's in the mountains; it gets very cold. The irony of all of this is that there are laws on the books in Lesotho that reserve small businesses for locals. Okay, so only a Basotho citizen is permitted to run a small shop like this. Okay, but somehow Chinese can land, and one day and the next day they can have a Lesotho passport, Lesotho ID, Lesotho trading licenses. These and other Basotho are the ones kind of selling these products on the black market and renting spaces. Or it's quite possible that the space is of most of these shops is actually owned by a Basotho citizen, but then they'll allow a Chinese person to sell because they're making more money off rent and work a lot less than it is for them to just have a Chinese do the business for them. So there are high levels of corruption, and that's a huge issue in that country. So there are laws; they're not being implemented, they're not being enforced. The next slide. There are all kinds of little grocery stores and corner markets like this as well, all run now by Chinese. Oftentimes the goods that are sold are considered low or of poor quality. A lot of the grocery stores are accused of selling expired or stale goods, of doing things like changing the dates. When we were there doing interviews, everyone had a story to tell about a Chinese and how some Chinese person had swindled them. So they were talking about those kind of multiple packs of chicken meat, cut up chicken meat, and they're saying the Chinese would take, a 12-pack and take out one piece and repackage it, and then out of the 12-pack, make 13, and they would take bags of mealie meal to make the staple kind of cornmeal porridge, and they would pour off a little bit and then reseal it and sell off, and so they could kind of sell more. And these are tiny, small little tricks, but everyone had a story about it. And then the other major complaint is that the Chinese run these shops and they don't hire many locals. And so there's a whole litany of complaints in Lesotho. Okay. So again, what I think is important to recall in the Lesotho case, and when you think back to the perceptions and why the perceptions are so negative about the Chinese, is that Lesotho is one of the smallest countries in South Africa. It's just over 30,000 square kilometers in size. This was a former kingdom. During colonial and apartheid periods in South Africa, Lesotho was a British protectorate and only got its independence in 1966. Currently, it's a constitutional monarchy with a prime minister and a ceremonial king. But they're also, the politics in Lesotho are highly fractious. I mean, and we have our expert in Lesotho here. It's very mountainous. There's very little arable land. It's very poor and underdeveloped. 40% of the population live below the poverty line, and it has a small and diminishing population, as I said. In 2004, the census recorded that there were 2.3 million, and that's now down to 1.8 million. Traditionally, it's a country of outmigration. Lesotho have never received immigrants, with a handful of kind of intrepid souls like Bob Edgar going there regularly to do research. Some development people. During the apartheid period, there were lots of Westerners who kind of had their headquarters in Maseru because they didn't want to be based in South Africa, but they were working on South Africa issues. And as soon as South Africa became, had its first free and fair elections, they all left. So in 1994, the second half of the 90s, Maseru lost a huge number of its international kind of community. And apart from that, it's been pretty homogenous, and people usually men went for mining jobs in South Africa. Women have been going in increasing numbers into South Africa for domestic jobs. A lot of young, promising Basotho end up in universities in South Africa, never to return. So it's been a country of outmigration, and in this context, you suddenly have huge numbers of Chinese, and so it's had a huge impact. And then, to contribute to this, as we said, there are high levels of poverty and unemployment, a very fraught and highly contested political system, high levels of corruption within each of the various government departments, and a lack of implementation and enforcement of local laws and regulations. And I think with regards to Lesotho, it's also important to note that its kind of physical location, it's completely surrounded by South Africa, and the impact of South Africa on Lesotho's development, Lesotho's politics, shouldn't be ignored. The other thing that's interesting is as with the Zimbabwe and the ZANU-PF, the current Lesotho government has close links with China. They want to retain these close links. They look to China as a potential source of foreign aid and of trade. And so there's this kind of signal that's sent from the highest levels about the importance of China and the Chinese. And so it's not said directly, but there is a message that gets sent down from the government to kind of leave the Chinese alone. We need the Chinese, we need their investment. But there's an inability to separate between kind of Chinese government investment and the Chinese migrants and the illegal or practices that are taking place in the country. But officials turn a blind eye because China is so important. And so there's the impact of international relations, of the bilateral relations on the kind of local realities. As I mentioned earlier, there's a huge dependence on the Taiwanese, and for most people in Lesotho, for most people in Africa, we all look alike, right? So you can say that this one's Taiwanese, this one's Chinese, this one's Korean, but it doesn't matter. We all look alike, no one can tell the difference, and so you mustn't bother them. They're important to our country's development, is the message that gets passed on. And so I think what's important here is to try to understand the perceptions in these contexts, in a context that's both historicized and contextualized locally as well as globally. I have slides about China and Zimbabwe. I don't know that we'll be able to, and China and South Africa. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through everything, but I will go through Zimbabwe and maybe stop. Actually, can we skip Zimbabwe? I'm going to go to South Africa. Okay. That's fine. Okay, South Africa's experience with China and Chinese has been very different. As I said earlier, there's an established Chinese-South African community there. That's Uncle Walter. He's like the unofficial mayor of the local Chinatown. And Johannesburg actually has two Chinatowns. There's an old Chinatown, or what they call First Chinatown, which is still kind of the bastion of the Chinese South Africans. And then there's this newer Chinatown in Cyrildene, which is in a different part of town entirely, and it's populated by new Chinese migrants. There are Chinese restaurants all over Johannesburg, in both the Chinatowns as well as in upscale shopping malls. You've got huge kind of impact is growing of Chinese herbal medicines, acupuncture, massage, available both kind of in these kind of unofficial looking, kind of clinics, as well as higher end kind of Chinese massage and acupuncture offered in the suburbs. There are major new Chinese investments taking place in Johannesburg. So there's a whole sector in what was previously kind of the gold fields, where just to the west of downtown Johannesburg, where there were a lot of gold mines, you have these mine dumps. And for years, nobody developed anything on the mine dumps. And now the Chinese are actually coming in and investing in these areas. And so they're building these huge wholesale distribution centers, as well as warehouses, and these new investments mean using local contractors, local architects, local construction workers. Stellar Park is a recently completed warehouse complex, very kind of upmarket, looks very nice, and from there you can see the new soccer stadium in Soweto and Gold Reef City, which is the big, and the lights of downtown Joburg. And if you go to the next slide, there's this huge area adjacent to Stellar Park, this wholesale, where they're building this wholesale city. And this was going on. I was just there 2 weeks ago. And so this is the kind of development that's taking place there. Cyril Dean was historically a Jewish neighborhood in the east of downtown Johannesburg, not far from the airport. And this new Chinatown is growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, when I first moved to Johannesburg, it didn't exist. There was 1 or 2 shops that had opened up, and in the intervening decade, it has become this very vibrant center of Chinese kind of activities. And this is, initially it was kind of, they just took occupancy of buildings that were already there. And so you would see Chinese signage on top of the buildings. But now they're actually building and constructing big kind of 2-3-story buildings with, the architecture, the bringing in specialists to do the wood carving and the tiles. And, you see lots more dragons and tigers. The lions and the kind of Chinese symbolism. So it's changing the look of Johannesburg. But then you also have this in Sandton. Sandton is kind of the shishi high-end kind of, where a lot of the financial industry has moved, a lot of the banks. Rand Merchant Bank is there, and right there you have the construction of Sino Steel Plaza. And if you look in the next one, also the headquarters of China Construction Bank. And so in Johannesburg, you see, and in South Africa in general, there's a very different kind of influence, and it's much broader, and it's much more spread out. And if you look at the next picture, okay, sorry, can you just go back to the photo? This is something that people ask me a lot as I've been doing this kind of research, is there much engagement? Are the Chinese interacting? Or Chinese in many places are considered to be very isolated and standoffish. They don't mix, they don't mingle. And I think it really depends on the circumstances and the situation. In Lesotho, you have Chinese that have only been there for 2 or 3 years. They still don't speak the language. They might hire 1 or 2 people. It was interesting in the factories. They've actually invented a language similar to Fanagalo, which was spoken in the mines, which is a combination of very limited vocabulary, but a combination of various languages spoken by the different African mine workers and the Afrikaner kind of mine, what are they called, the supervisors. In the textile industry, they're also kind of combined words of Chinese and English and Sotho to be able to communicate in the textile factories in a way that's been quite organic, but it's taken place over more than a decade of life there. So that's in the textile factories. You know, if you look at the retail shops, you'll see very little engagement. The Chinese still are quite isolated because they're brand new there. They oftentimes they're coming from poor peasant backgrounds. A lot of them don't have educations. They haven't finished their schooling in China, and so it's very difficult for them to learn any other language. But you know, you also have instances like this, and here the Indian South African woman and the Taiwanese gentleman have been married now for almost 20 years. They've got 2 children. They run and operate one of the most successful Chinese restaurants right there in Cyrildene, and it's been there for ages, and they've got all these kind of awards. And the black South African guy decided I was taking pictures, so he needed to be in the middle of it as well. Okay. So in South Africa, you do have complaints. And the first one that I'll put out there is the one that you mentioned, is the Dalai Lama visa issue. Now, Zuma and the government kind of swears up and down that they didn't actually turn him down, that it was still being processed, but you know, he applied late, and you know, the Dalai Lama couldn't wait any longer, and he decided to cancel the trip. And this is the second time that it's happened. It actually happened a couple years ago when the Dalai Lama was invited to participate in a pre-World Cup event. Again, both of these instances were not government functions. There was, in my opinion, there was no reason the South African government needed to kind of turn him down. But you know, the way that this is portrayed is that the South African government is bending over backwards because they don't want to insult their most important trading partner now. And it speaks to China's growing influence, not only over kind of trade issues, but over politics in general. From the liberal democratic opposition, both the white and the black, you have the same litany of complaints that you hear often in the US about the lack of democracy in China, about how China's non-interference policy props up dictatorial leaders, same kind of complaints about labor abuses and the failure to protect the environment. And then there's a whole slew of complaints about the cheap quality of China-made goods. And there's actually a term that gets tossed around quite often, and there was actually a South African rap artist who wrote a song about Fong Kong. And Fong Kong is the general term for anything that's fake or copy. And it's incredible how this term that was just invented has taken off, because now PR firms use it in advertising. They say things like, "We're not Fong Kong, we're the real McCoy," stuff like that. And then COSATU is the union of trade unions, and their big issue with China is that the import of China-made goods, the impact that it's having on local manufacturing has been devastating, and that local manufacture, particularly in clothing and shoes, has suffered tremendously. And you know, there again, you need to unpack what's going on. You know, how competitive were the South African companies to begin with? Not very. You know, and it speaks more to kind of the inexperience of South African policymakers and kind of opening up markets without protecting certain industries, or you know, about South Africa not having an industrial policy, perhaps. So there are legitimate complaints. Some of these complaints are very legitimate, but again, I think it's important to try to unpack each of the complaints and not take at face value a lot of the kind of headlines that we read in the newspaper. Why are Chinese in South Africa kind of not hated in the same way as they are in Lesotho? There are lots of mitigating factors despite the complaints. There's been, as I mentioned before, historical presence of Chinese in townships and in cities throughout the country for many, many years. And so, contrary to what I've read in some papers, there's no predisposition to hating the Chinese. It's not like you're going to go to every African country and